We hear a lot about being woke these days, woke corporations, students on campus or professors who think that they're woke. And I want to make the case that wokeism is racism. Now, wokeism presents itself in the opposite mode. It presents itself as a move away from bigotry, from racism to enlightenment. To be woke is to undergo a certain kind of transformation, a conversion experience. But I want to argue that the conversion experience is not away from bigotry, but toward bigotry. That when you become woke, you actually develop a stronger racial consciousness. You begin to think about people in racial terms, and you have a hidden, but nevertheless unmistakable foundation, a foundational assumption of black inferiority. Now, here is Don Lemon, the host of CNN, complaining about racism. In an interview with the Washington Post, he says, "I don't know if America sees black people, and especially black gay men, as fully human." He's putting the blame here on America. Americans don't see blacks as fully human. And in general, when people try to blame America on the left, they appeal to American history. They go, wait a minute, Dinesh, look at the 3/5 clause in the Constitution, which declares that blacks are only worth 3/5 of a human being. That is the sort of prima facie evidence typically supplied. And it's based upon a complete fallacy, because the argument between the North and the South, the northern and southern states, had to do with political representation. How many congressmen, how many representatives each side gets. Now, the North, which is the anti-slavery side, wanted blacks to count for 0. Why? Because it wanted to reduce the political power of the southern states. The South, which wanted more congressmen, more representation, in order to protect its slave interests, the southern states wanted blacks to count for 1. So you see right away that although the 3/5 number that was agreed upon was a kind of compromise, to kind of bring the two sides together and get a union, that number, whatever you think of the compromise, had nothing to do with the intrinsic worth of blacks or African Americans at all. So this is simply a canard, one of those sort of historical lies that has embedded itself in left-wing consciousness. But moving away a little bit from history for a moment, we turn now to Senator Sheldon Whitehouse. This is the Democratic senator from Rhode Island, who evidently still belongs to an all-white beach club. Not only does he belong to it, but it's been repeatedly brought to his attention over the last several years, and he's still, through his family, a member. He was asked about this recently. Listen.
Okay, back in 2017, you had expressed concerns about the membership of the all-white Bailey's Beach Club, said that you hoped it would become more diverse. Now, your family's been members, your wife is one of the largest shareholders. Has there been any traction in that? Are there any minority members of the club now?
I think the people who are running the place are still working on that, and I'm sorry it hasn't happened yet.
Do you have concerns in 2021? I mean, obviously it's been 4 years. You had remarks on the floor following the deaths of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd saying, hoping to root out systemic racism in the country. Your thoughts on an elite, all-white, wealthy club, again, in this day and age, should these clubs continue to exist?
It's a long tradition.
What? It's a long tradition? That's your defense? I mean, this guy must know that he only gets away with this kind of thing because he's a Democrat. I mean, can you imagine if the roles were reversed? Ted Cruz belongs to an all-white beach club. Hey, Senator Cruz, are you going to quit? No. Why not? Well, it's a long tradition in Texas. That would never happen. Cruz would resign immediately from the club. But in this case, you've got a guy who obviously, and look at his confident tone. He's as if, what's the big deal? It's a tradition in Rhode Island. I want to be part of that tradition. So what if bigotry is part of the tradition? That's me. Now, it turns out that this club, which is called the Bailey Beach Club, doesn't apparently have any blacks. There was an interview some time ago, actually several years ago, in which they interviewed one of the members, and they go, yeah, we got Jews, but, quote, blacks, not really, a woman named Miss Oswald said. So it's not that they have a rule against blacks, they just don't have any blacks in the club. And apparently when this was brought to the attention of Whitehouse some years ago, in 2010, he, quote, resigned, but it was a fake resignation. Why? Because he transferred his membership to his wife. And not only is his wife now the member, but she's apparently one of the club's biggest shareholders. So to the degree that the club represents white supremacy, she's investing in it. This is Whitehouse. Now, the thing about this guy Whitehouse is that in a way, you'd have to say that he fits in with a democratic tradition of bigotry. And we see this all over the place. Here's Hunter Biden, turns out, casually using the N-word. It's all over his computer. And he calls white guys the N-word. And think about it. If Hunter Biden uses that kind of language so casually, he probably used it at home. The Bidens knew about it. They didn't mind. If they did, look at the way they fight against bigotry elsewhere. Oh, we're against bigotry. We're fighting against racism. But in your own family, it's perfectly okay. Let's remember, Hillary and Barack Obama both called Robert Byrd. This guy was the exalted cyclops of the Ku Klux Klan. And Hillary calls him her mentor. Biden spoke at his funeral. Biden, by the way, has also talked in avuncular terms about how he palled around with segregationists. These are, by the way, Democratic segregationists, the so-called Dixiecrats, and their buildings named after them in Washington, D.C. So this shows you that it isn't merely historically that the Democrats are the party of bigotry. They're the party of bigotry right now. And they condone bigotry. When Whitehouse made these comments, Breitbart News contacted the NAACP. No comment. The Black Caucus, no comment. So suddenly all these civil rights groups, which are otherwise militant, Al Sharpton's flying in on his private jet, they go dead silent when it's their own team. In other words, they overlook bigotry when it occurs on the Democratic side, almost as if they kind of expect it. Now, the reason that wokeism is racism at its core is it has a built-in assumption of black inferiority. If you listen to these woke people talk, you realize that they don't expect anything, and I mean anything, out of blacks. They say things like, well, we can't expect blacks to be on time. That's because the concept of time is kind of a Western concept. We can't expect blacks to get an ID. Everybody else gets an ID, but somehow for blacks, getting an ID is like unbelievably strenuous. It's tough to get IDs, if you're black. Black people aren't expected to do math. They can't think in a linear way, apparently. And so you've got all these woke critiques of math. Math proceeds logically, one step to another. That's kind of a white man's way of thinking. And again, when it comes to university admission standards, the expectation is that if they were meritocratic, well, pretty much no blacks would get in. If PhD programs were meritocratic, they would essentially be made up largely of whites and Asians with a sprinkling of Hispanics. When it comes to jobs, when it comes to government contracts, when it comes to promotions, when it comes to pretty much everything, blacks have got to be treated differently than every other group. It's almost as if, Booker T. Washington, the great black leader, once talked about the American standard. And what he meant by this is the American competitive standard. To get ahead in America, you got to compete. It's sort of like a national Olympics at all kinds of levels. But it's almost as if wokeism presumes that for blacks, you don't have an American standard. You have to set up a separate black standard. You can't have an American Olympics. You have to set up a kind of special Olympics. You've got to treat blacks in the way that, for example, athletic programs treat special needs kids. And this is terrible. This is, in fact, racism in its most corrosive form. Why? Because the built-in assumption is that these people, African Americans, are not as good as everyone else. They are not just socially or culturally, but they are naturally, they are by virtue of being black, not only inferior, but expected to be inferior. For this reason, I believe that wokeism is today the most insidious contemporary embodiment of racism.